He had walked further into the alien wilds than any other human before him. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of wet earth and strange pollen, the kind that clung to his throat. The ground shifted under his boots in ways that told him this land wasn't meant for careless steps. He was an explorer, nothing more, mapping places few had heard of and fewer dared to enter. The thick canopy overhead turned daylight into dim twilight, and silence pressed in until it was broken by a sound that froze him in place. Ragged cries, desperate, drowning. He followed the sound, shoving through twisted roots and low branches, until he saw her. She was no human, but her form was unmistakably person-like, tall, strong-limbed, skin patterned in natural markings like paint. She thrashed waist-deep in a pit of shifting soil that looked solid until it pulled you under. Quicksand, though alive in a way his instincts didn't like, sluggish, hungry, pulling tighter with every movement. Her eyes met his, wide with fury at herself, terror at the pit, and disbelief that anyone had found her. He dropped his pack without hesitation. Logic told him this wasn't his problem, that interfering with locals often led to trouble, but he wasn't the type to watch someone die. The ground was treacherous, forcing him to spread his weight as he moved close enough to toss her a line of cord. She tried to pull herself, but the pit clung to her legs like iron. He dug his heels into the roots at the edge and hauled, every muscle straining. Inch by inch, she rose out of the trap, screaming in defiance at the earth that tried to consume her. The final lurch nearly dragged him in with her, but she collapsed onto the bank instead, gasping, covered in mud. For a heartbeat, she simply stared at him, her chest heaving, disbelief giving way to something like awe. Then shadows shifted around them. He realized they were not alone. Warriors emerged from the trees, tall figures armed with curved blades, markings of the same kind as the woman, their gazes sharp and unreadable. He raised his hand slowly, signaling no threat, but their eyes were not on him. They were on her. She lifted herself with pride, though still weak, and pointed at him with a trembling hand. The warriors looked at one another, then at him, and dropped to one knee in unison. Their chant rose, deep and solemn, a rhythm that vibrated in his bones. Confusion struck harder than fear. He asked what was happening, but their words were lost beneath the chant. The woman's voice broke through at last, hoarse but commanding. She told him he had done more than save her life. By their law, by ancient decree, the one who saved the blood heir of the clan was bound to rule. He stared at her, certain he'd misunderstood. But she repeated it with finality. He was no longer just a traveler. He was Lord. He tried to refuse, tried to laugh off the absurdity. He insisted he wanted no part of their customs, that he had no claim over them. But his protest meant nothing. The law was older than any of them, sacred and absolute. No warrior would defy it. The chants grew louder, echoing through the forest, carrying a weight that pressed down on him like chains. The woman approached, her strength returning with each step, and looked him directly in the eye. There was no trace of weakness left. She told him he had bound himself to her people with his own hands. A savior was more than a rescuer, it was destiny fulfilled. And destiny was not optional. The realization cut deep. What he thought was a simple act of humanity had thrust him into a role of power he neither wanted nor understood. Around him, every warrior bowed, their eyes filled with reverence and expectation. He wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was something far more dangerous in their world, the Chosen. And as their chants roared into the dim forest air, he understood one thing with certainty. His life was no longer his own. They marched him through the forest with chants that never wavered, a living wall of warriors that offered no escape. The village revealed itself at last, a sprawl of stone and timber carved into the landscape, smoke rising from central fires, banners marked with claw-like symbols swaying in the humid wind. Eyes followed him from every corner, sharp with suspicion, heavy with judgment. To them, he was an outsider stepping onto ground meant only for kin, yet bound law had made him more than kin. He was Lord, whether he wished it or not. The woman he had saved stood at his side, her presence both shield and tether. Her name was whispered with reverence, the heir of the clan, the only child of their late chieftain. Without her, their people would fracture, but with him, the law demanded continuity. Her voice steadied the crowd, reminding them of tradition, of the binding power of rescue. He had saved her, and by that act, saved them all. Resistance cracked against the weight of ritual. The ceremony came swiftly. Before he could make sense of it, they painted his arms with streaks of ochre, pressed a carved talisman into his palm, and crowned him with the mantle of command. The words were foreign, yet the intent was clear. He was no longer himself. He was the embodiment of their law, the vessel of their prophecy. He fought to speak, to tell them he had no knowledge of their ways, that he would fail them if they relied on him, but silence crushed his words. They did not want denial. They wanted a leader. Whispers spread like fire through the crowd. Some muttered that the law was too old, that no foreigner could carry the weight of their bloodlines. Others clung to the promise of prophecy, murmuring that his arrival was foretold. Among the warriors, defiance simmered. A scarred fighter spat at the ground and called him weak, daring him to prove otherwise. It was not just hatred of outsiders, but fear that following him meant ruin. The clan was surrounded by enemies, and now their survival rested on someone who did not even belong. He refused to posture or boast. Instead, he admitted his ignorance and lack of strength, yet promised he would not abandon them. His honesty unsettled them, and used to leaders who did not claim invincibility. The heir stepped forward to vouch for him, her voice cutting through the discord. She declared that he had risked his life for hers, and by law, his will was now bound to theirs. Her loyalty steadied the clan, but unease remained. Days followed where he was forced to learn their world at a brutal pace. Every ritual, every gesture, every rule was explained to him by the heir, who watched him with wary curiosity. He observed, questioned, and adapted, not as they expected, but as only a human could. Where they saw tradition, he saw patterns. Where they accepted danger, he saw solutions. His strange perspective gave him an edge he didn't know he possessed. When hunters returned with broken weapons, he showed them how to reinforce shafts with bindings from his own pack. When children fought over scraps, he arranged portions more efficiently, cutting waste without offense. These small acts unsettled the elders, who muttered about change, yet the people noticed. Respect began to flicker among them, not for strength, but for results. Still, resentment festered among those who craved a warrior's lord, not a thinker's. It did not take long for word to spread beyond the village. Scouts brought news that rival clans mocked them for bending knee to an alien. One warlord in particular sent a message carved into bone: surrender the outsider or face destruction. The threat hung over them like smoke, undeniable and immediate. Elders turned to him with sharp eyes, testing whether he would falter. Some secretly hoped he would abandon them, proving their doubts. Instead, he stood his ground. He would not surrender them, nor himself. The scarred warrior who had mocked him seized the moment, stepping forward with a booming voice. If the new lord was truly chosen, let him prove it. Let him face a challenge, not with words or cleverness, but with blood and strength. The people cheered the demand, hungry for certainty. Tradition demanded a trial. The heir tried to intervene, but the crowd roared louder. The trial was set. He knew then the truth of his position. The law bound him, the people doubted him, and enemies waited at their gates. He could not refuse the trial without losing all claim to rule. He could not fight it as they fought, for their bodies were carved from muscle and years of war. But surrender was never in him. Survival was the human instinct, the one thing he had carried across every step of his life. If the trial would decide his fate, then he would not meet it with their strength. He would meet it with his own. That night, as fires burned low and chants echoed through the village, he sat alone, the talisman of command heavy in his hand. He had never wanted this. He had never asked for their law, their prophecy, their destiny. Yet destiny had found him. Tomorrow it would test him. And in that test, He would show them that humanity's strength was not in might, but in refusal to surrender, in the ability to turn the impossible into survival. The trial began at dawn, marked not by ceremony, but by silence. The villagers gathered in a wide circle, their faces painted in solemn streaks of red and black. The scarred warrior stepped into the center, muscles coiled, eyes burning with contempt. He carried a weapon shaped like a hooked blade, the kind meant to tear as much as cut. Around him, the crowd roared approval. They believed this duel would end the farce of an outsider lord. He stood opposite, unarmed by choice, refusing to imitate what he could not match. The law did not bind him to fight their way, only to survive the trial. His enemies sneered, calling him coward, but he remained steady. Strength would not save him, but strategy might. He studied the ground, the spacing, the rhythm of his opponent's stance, every detail feeding into a plan that formed without words. When the signal came, the scarred warrior charged, blade flashing. He sidestepped, letting momentum carry the strike wide, and reached for the terrain. Loose soil, a broken branch, anything to turn into advantage. He had spent the night studying their arena, memorizing its flaws, its hidden edges. Each step was calculated, forcing his opponent into overextension. The villagers shouted in confusion as he moved like no warrior they had seen, conserving energy, striking not with strength, but with precision. The first real blow came not from muscle but from foresight. As the warrior lunged again, he angled him toward a shallow pit where roots had weakened the ground. One step too heavy, and the earth shifted, throwing balance off. That was the moment he seized, grabbing the warrior's arm, using the man's own weight to topple him. Gasps echoed, disbelief sharp in the air. The warrior rose with rage, swinging wildly now, pride wounded deeper than flesh. The blade nicked his arm, drawing blood, but pain only sharpened his resolve. He baited the next strike, retreating toward a spot where he had laid a trap at dawn, a crude snare made from vines and sharpened stakes. When the warrior pressed forward, the ground betrayed him, the snare tightening around his ankle, pulling him off balance once more. The crowd erupted, some shouting outrage, others stunned into silence. To them, fighting was strength against strength, blood against blood. Yet here was their so-called lord using wit, cunning, and preparation to bend the fight. To them, it looked dishonorable. To him, it was survival. The scarred warrior tore free with brute force, bleeding now, his fury blinding him. He charged with a roar, intending to finish the fight in one decisive strike. But the outsider met him head-on, not with strength, but with leverage. He deflected the blade with a makeshift shield of wood torn from the arena's edge, shoved hard at the warrior's wound, and sent him sprawling. The man hit the ground hard, his weapon flying from his grasp. For a long moment no one moved. Dust settled, the crowd holding its breath. He stood over the warrior, holding no blade, claiming no kill. Instead, he dropped the broken wood and stepped back. His voice rang clear, cutting through the silence. He said he did not come to destroy their people or mock their traditions. He fought to live, and in living, to lead, not as they expected, but as only he could. If they wanted a ruler who mirrored them, he was not it. But if they wanted survival, they would have it. The warrior on the ground spat blood, but did not rise. Pride had been shattered, and with it, the certainty of his defiance. The law was clear. The outsider had endured, had triumphed, and by their code, he was lord. Murmurs spread through the crowd, disbelief shifting to grudging acceptance. Some still scowled, unwilling to yield, but others bowed their heads. Tradition had spoken, and the outsider had proven himself, not with might, but with something far more alien and unsettling. The heir stepped forward, her voice carrying strength where his lacked force. She declared the trial fulfilled, the law satisfied. Their clan now stood under his banner, and anyone who defied it defied the ancestors themselves. Her words carried weight no warrior could dismiss. Slowly, the chant began again, hesitant at first, then swelling into a roar. His name echoed across the arena, No longer a curse, but a recognition. He felt no triumph, only the weight of a burden settling deeper. He had not wanted this, but it was his now. The people looked at him with a mixture of awe, fear, and hope. He was not one of them, yet he had survived where they thought he would fail. That survival alone marked him as something more in their eyes. The scarred warrior knelt at last, beaten not only by traps and tactics, but by the unyielding will that refused to break. Others followed, one by one, until the circle was filled with bowed heads. The outsider had passed the trial, and the clan belonged to him. Night fell with fires burning high, voices raised not in mockery, but in chants of allegiance. He stood apart, staring into the flames, knowing what it meant. The trial had proven his right to lead, but also painted a target on his back. Rival clans would see his rise as an insult, a threat to be answered with steel and blood. He had bound himself to this people by chance, but chance had become destiny, and destiny demanded more than survival. It demanded rule. The trial was over, but the true weight of command settled on his shoulders in the days that followed. Victory had silenced doubt for the moment, yet doubt was not gone. The people watched him with careful eyes, waiting to see if his strength had ended in the arena or if he could shape their future. He knew that a single display of survival was not enough. Leadership was not won in one fight. It had to be proven in every decision every day. The clan stood at the edge of ruin. Their fields were meager, their tools old, their warriors tired from endless border raids. Rival clans circled like wolves, testing weaknesses, hungry for land and blood. The elders clung to tradition, their faith resting on rituals that had carried them for generations, yet those same rituals had chained them to stagnation. He saw what they could not. He saw potential buried beneath old patterns, and he knew survival demanded change. He began not with grand speeches, but with small actions. He worked beside hunters, showing them how to weave stronger cords from vines, how to set traps that used weight and leverage rather than brute strength. He joined gatherers, teaching them to sort food stores more efficiently, cutting waste that had starved them before winter. Each lesson was met first with skepticism, then with surprise when results appeared. His ways were strange, but they worked, and the people began to whisper that perhaps the law had chosen wisely after all. Warriors, still uncertain, tested him constantly. They expected him to falter in drills, to fail in endurance. He did not try to outmatch them. Instead, he reshaped them. He split them into smaller groups, teaching coordination and formation, breaking the habit of each man fighting alone for his own glory. Where they once charged with reckless fury, he taught them to move with precision, to strike as one, to shield one another. They resisted, but when a raid came without warning, his tactics turned what could have been a slaughter into a defense that held. The enemy retreated, leaving behind not corpses, but proof. His methods were not weakness. They were survival. The heir watched closely, her loyalty deepening with every step he took to protect her people. Where others saw an intruder, she began to see a leader forged from more than law. She told him of the prophecy whispered through generations, that an outsider would come in the clan's darkest hour, one who would not fight as they fought, but who would guide them with a vision alien to their blood. Many had dismissed it as myth, yet every action he took gave it form. Still, shadows gathered. Rival clans could not ignore his rise. Scouts brought word of war bands uniting, convinced that his presence defiled ancient order. They feared what his leadership might bring, and fear drove them to prepare for conquest. The elders trembled, convinced their destruction was near. But he did not bend. He reminded them that survival was not gifted, it was earned. If enemies came, they would meet not the fractured clan they once mocked, but a people reborn. He forged alliances within his walls, calling not for obedience through fear, but through trust. He treated the lowest worker with the same respect as the fiercest warrior, breaking down barriers that had divided them. When disputes rose, he judged not by tradition alone, but by reason, ensuring fairness that shocked those who had lived under rigid law. Slowly, suspicion gave way to loyalty. Not all accepted him, but enough did that when he stood, they stood with him. The first great test of this unity came swiftly. A warlord from a neighboring clan marched on their lands, certain that the outsiders' rule would crumble at the first true battle. But when their banners appeared on the horizon, the people did not scatter. They formed ranks as he had trained them, traps laid across fields, choke points prepared in the forest paths. When the enemy charged, expecting chaos, they found resistance disciplined and relentless. Every trap slowed them. Every strike was answered in unison. The enemy pressed harder, but the clan held. It was not brute strength that turned the tide, but preparation, patience, and tactics none of their kind had seen before. When the enemy finally broke, retreating in disarray, the chants rose louder than ever. His name carried not as an outsider, but as their lord. He had not only defended them, he had reshaped them into something greater than they had been. They had faced annihilation and survived, not through prophecy alone, but through the will of one human who refused to surrender. After the battle, he stood before them, bloodied but unbroken, and spoke plainly. He told them he had never sought power, never asked to lead. Yet fate had bound him to their people, and if destiny demanded his strength, then he would give it. Not because he desired their throne, but because he would not allow those he saved to fall. He told them that his humanity was not weakness, but a weapon, one forged from centuries of survival in worlds far harsher than theirs. And as long as he drew breath, their enemies would never find them easy prey again. The clan roared with approval, the sound shaking the night. The heir stood at his side, eyes fierce with pride, and the elders bowed at last, acknowledging what they could no longer deny. He had become more than lord by law. He had become lord by choice, by action, by the strength of a spirit they could not break. From that day forward, the clan walked a new path. They fought not as scattered warriors, but as a united people. They thrived where once they starved. Their neighbors whispered his name in fear. Their enemies hesitated where once they pressed without thought. And though he carried the weight of leadership like a chain, he bore it without falter. For he knew what they did not. Humanity's strength was never in being the strongest, but in never yielding, never stopping, never allowing the impossible to stand unchallenged. He had dragged one woman from the quicksand, and in doing so, he had pulled an entire people from the pit of decline. By accident, by law, by prophecy, he had become their lord. But by will, by resilience, and by the unshakable nature of his humanity, he had become something greater, their future.